Hey everyone, so we are coming off of our interview with C.L. Clarke, author of The Unbroken, and now I'm here to introduce you to our second video in the Written with Purpose series, which is my interview with Eugen Bacon. I want to just talk about the origin story of this relationship because yes, now we are in a bookish relationship. So I found out about Eugen because I attended the FIACon 2020 conference, and that the convention was a place for writers of color and readers of color and members of like the spec-fic community to come together. FIA Literary Mag is an amazing online magazine, an amazing community for all of us. So if you're interested in speculative writing by people of color and indigenous folks and queer folks, then there is community to be found in FIACon 2020. And humble brag, I am one of the guests of honor for the 2021 FIACon convention, and I am so proud and honored to have been asked. But going back to Eugen Bacon, that is where I first found out about her because she was one of the panelists on one of the panels that I watched. And of course, not gonna lie, the first thing that I noticed about Eugen was just how contemplative and thoughtful and beautifully she spoke about her writing, about writing in general, and also just about being who she is in the world as an African Australian writer. So I'm not going to be reading any of the synopses of her works because one thing that's really unique about our conversation is that we actually go through a lot of her writing, and she actually talks about the purpose behind all of the pieces that she mentions in our discussion. So I'm not going to spoil that for you, but I will read you Eugen's bio. Eugen M. Bacon, MA, MSc, PhD, is African Australian. A computer graduate mentally re-engineered into creative writing, she studied at Maritime Campus, less than 2 minutes walk from the Royal Observatory of the Greenwich Meridian. Her work has been shortlisted, longlisted, or commended in national and international awards, including the Bridgeport Prize, Copyright Agency Prize, Australian Shadows Awards, Ditmar Awards, and Namo Award for Speculative Fiction by Africans. Out now, she's got Writing Speculative Fiction, which I own and love, Claiming Timo, published by Meerkat Press. In 2020, Her Bitch Dress, Ginadera Press. It's Folking Political, published by Ginadera Press. The Road to Whoop Whoop and Other Stories, published by Meerkat Press. Hadithi, The State of Black Speculative Fiction, by Luna Press Publishing. Ivory's Story, Newcon Press. And in 2021, we saw Speculate, published by Meerkat Press, Black Moon, IFWG, and Eugen is represented by Biek van Egelen of the African Literary Agency. She's also a professional editor. It was an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with Eugen Bacon, and I really hope that you enjoy our discussion, and particularly the comments that Eugen makes about identity and how identity drives art and writing and publishing, and what her experiences have been with different kinds of fiction and interplay with other creatives. Enjoy. Okay. So yes, thank you so much for agreeing to this conversation, and I learned about your work, Eugen, when I went to the FIACon conference in 2020, and I was just moved. I was moved by a number of things. Like I loved how passionately and how thoughtfully you spoke about your craft. And I also learned, like, while you were actually on the panel, I looked you up because we can do that. You can do that when you're attending panels virtually. And then I found like The Road to Whoop Whoop, and what was the other one that I found? And Claiming Timo. And then I was just like, I've never met somebody who identifies as an African Australian. let alone as a a writer of speculative fiction who is a Black woman. And I was just like, wow, who is Eugen? I need to know. And now you're here. So thank you.
I'm so excited to be here. When you reached out and wanted to do a session with me, that was really fantastic.
Well, I'm chuffed that you said yes. And I know I think that for me, this is to satisfy my own curiosity because identity matters. And I just want to start with a question about your identity. So what does it mean to you when you identify as an African Australian? Because it is in all of your bios, and I would assume that that's an identity that, at least in terms of the world of speculative fiction, I haven't come across anyone else who writes speculative fiction and shares your identity. So can we start with that?
Yes, I feel very comfortable now identifying as an African Australian. This wasn't always the case because I think for a while I grappled with my identity, and I'll tell you why. I was born in Tanzania, and then my family moved to Kenya, and they're both in East Africa. And I lived in Kenya for a while, and when my family went back to Tanzania, I stayed in Kenya. But I never really seemed to belong because in Kenya, they always talked about me as the Tanzanian. And when I went back home to visit, they always talked about me as the Kenyan because I was the in between. And then later, I lived and studied in the UK. And I think similarly, here I was sort of like suddenly a minority group surrounded by white people. And it was quite a different experience. And I think at the time, just about the time when I started writing, I was writing for white people because all my characters had blue eyes and green eyes and long flowing hair, and it was blonde and the dresses, and they had these super thin bodies. And I didn't see myself in my characters, but I was writing for white editors and white publishers and white readers, and I was giving them what I thought they wanted. Then I came to Australia, and my blackness was a different kind of blackness.
Mm.
Because in Australia, you have First Nations people, and I'm not a First Nations person. And I think it was really important for me to see where I fit in. I was sort of an other. And until I started writing Black people's stories, suddenly one day the penny dropped. It just felt right when I said I'm African Australian and when I introduced myself as an African Australian, because suddenly I didn't have to try to be African or try to be Australian. I could be both. And it just felt like a natural fit. And now that transcends into my writing as well, because my writing is a blend of cultures. It's about my hybridity and just writing Black people's stories and revisiting my culture. It's sort of like stories of longing and stories of memory, and it brings me back to Africa. It brings me back to my grandmother in the village. So yeah, I'm really comfortable now. It just feels right. It's like it was like coming out. It was like all my life I was repressed, and then suddenly this identity just, I could see my place in the world, and it feels normal.
And how long have you lived in Australia?
I came to Australia in 2005.
Mm.
So I lived in the UK. I think it was from 1999 to about 2000 and was it 2004, 2005 when
Mhm.
I came to Australia. And so I got married to an Aussie at the time,
Mm.
and he lived and worked in the UK, and I was studying there. And so, it was a natural occurrence. And it was once we had a child, like the UK can be a very lonely place for a small family,
Mhm.
and especially when you have a child. And we lived in an apartment building. And I remember one time an occupant died and nobody knew for weeks until the cleaner went. Like, that's how isolated it was. And so it reached a point where I proposed to my husband at the time that maybe let's go back to Australia because that's where your family is. There's a big network of support.
Yeah.
And he was on board with the idea. And I think it was one of the best decisions I ever made because, yeah, Australia feels like home, and Melbourne is where I am. Melbourne is where home is where your family is. And so my family is in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, but my family is also here because my son is here.
Mm-hmm. And I thank you for indulging me questions about identity. I think it's really meaningful. One of the reasons why I read Black science fiction and fantasy is because it's important for me that Black identities and the diversity of Black identities are centered in the work that I read. And so hence my questions about that. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about how you became a writer and how you transitioned from computer engineering, because you talk about being sort of re-engineered from the world of computers into the world of writing, and I'm really curious about how that transition happened.
Yes, so I'm one of the people who get really focused. When I do something, I give my everything to it. And an example of it is I did my PhD in 2.5 years. And they say that your PhD journey is as good as your supervisor. And I had an amazing supervisor. But that wasn't the start of my writing. So when I had my son and I was in London, and as I mentioned, London just felt really, really lonely. And I'm not the kind of person to twiddle my fingers. So I thought, what can I do? I've always loved writing. And I was the kind of person, if I wrote you an email, it would be a really juicy email. Or if I love letter writing in the days of, where you actually wrote a letter, and I'd write letters. I used to converse with my father that way. Unfortunately, he's not here anymore. But I loved writing. So I did an online writing course through the Writers Bureau. And there was a competition and I submitted.
I want to talk to you a little bit about how you became a writer and how you transitioned from computer engineering, because you talk about being sort of re-engineered from the world of computers into the world of writing, and I'm really curious about how that transition happened.
Yes, so I'm one of the people who get really focused. When I do something, I give my everything to it. And an example of it is I did my PhD in 2.5 years. And they say that your PhD journey is as good as your supervisor. And I had an amazing supervisor. But that wasn't the start of my writing. So when I had my son and I was in London, and as I mentioned, London just felt really, really lonely. And I'm not the kind of person to twiddle my fingers. So I thought, what can I do? I've always loved writing. And I was the kind of person, if I wrote you an email, it would be a really juicy email. Or if I love letter writing in the days of, where you actually wrote a letter, and I'd write letters. I used to converse with my father that way. Unfortunately, he's not here anymore. But I loved writing. So I did an online writing course through the Writers Bureau. And there was a competition and I submitted a story which is about a writer who was really trying to break through, and it was also daunting. And I think in hindsight, it was really a story about me, and it won the competition. And so I realized there must be something here. And so I kept writing and submitting to short story publications, but I didn't really break through in the UK at the time. Then I came to Australia and it was similar. I was shortlisted or I won just minor competitions, but I still loved writing. And it was very frustrating that it wasn't going anywhere. And until I did my PhD in writing while I was still doing the doctorate, it's almost like it opened my world. And it's really stupid, but people are silly that way. Suddenly I became credible. So when I submitted a story, I know I'd submit a story, and in my bio, if I said I'm doing a PhD in writing, it gave people, they gave it a go, and that's all you want as a writer. You
Mhm.
want them to give it a go. Just read the damn thing,
Yeah.
see if it's good or bad. And so I started getting more publications then, and that just really opened the door, and that's how I got into writing.
And so why speculative fiction?
Yeah.
Out of all the things you could write, why speculative fiction?
Why speculative fiction? I was always in love with speculative fiction, I think, because I have a very curious mind. I'm the kind of person who I always question things, and sometimes it got me into trouble. And my father loved giving me books. So when I did well in school, he'd give me books. And there were why and how stories, how the zebra got his stripes, how the crocodile lived in the water. And when you think about it, they're actually fantastical stories that were
Mhm.
speculative in their own right. And I grew up reading Kamara Laye and Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Wole Soyinka. And then I discovered literary writers. I read Toni Morrison, and I think the first book that I read was Beloved, and I was enchanted. It was such a dire story, but I couldn't believe anybody who wrote so beautifully. And suddenly, speculative fiction made sense. And just speaking about speculative fiction, when you think of speculative fiction, it's sort of like an umbrella term
Mhm.
for fantasy, science fiction, horror, and the paranormal and subgenres. And with making it speculative was really great for me, because then somebody approaching my reading didn't come with the questions: is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? Is it horror? And when you think of how, when you go to a bookshop, you don't go to the bookshop and say, well, I want to buy a fantasy, or I want to buy science fiction. You say, I am looking for Stephen King, or I am looking for Margaret Atwood, or I am looking for G.R.R. Martin. And the writers are really clever because they're beginning to write across genres. And so when you think of Stephen King's writing, like The Dom, it's science fiction and it's horror. When you think of Dr. Sleep, you have science fiction in the time travel, you have the horror, you have the fantastical in the magic. And so readers are unwittingly crossing genre, and we're reading more and more speculative fiction. And so for me, it really worked because I love the blurring of speculative fiction. It was a really comfortable space to be in because I am an experimental writer. I
Mhm.
love doing things that are quite unusual, and I'm really lucky to get published, because normally you tend to stick to the traditional, but I've always been very different in how I write, because I think I selfishly write for myself. Yeah, so speculative fiction is a really safe space for me to explore my curiosity, to explore my diversity, my hybridity. My characters can be any color, they can speak any language, they can be anywhere. It's all about the world building. And I can write stories of diversity and hope. I can interrogate climate change. I can look at, women and children in the village. And it's a very safe space because it's speculative. So people they come to read it, and they can accept it because you've painted it in that brush of speculation. But it can still be very powerful reading because of the concepts and the themes that you address.
I I have so many questions just coming out of what you've just said. But I want to say that one of the things that draw me to your work, and I'm new to your work, right? One of the things that draws me to your work is how playful you seem to be in terms of trying new things, right? So a lot of your work, I'm just looking, I have a stack of your books right here. So like, there's Habibi in the State of Black Speculative Fiction, which is you and Milton Davis. I noticed that this, and then also Speculate with you and Dominique Heck, right? These are
Yeah.
pieces that you've written in conversation with another writer, and I don't see that a lot. I don't see a lot of works or collections of works written by two people in conversation in that kind of way. So I'm curious about why it seems to be important to you. And also, what is it like to write with someone else who has a whole other brain and a whole other world?
Yeah, it's different. I think it's part of my curiosity.
Hmm.
I writing, when I approach writing, it's a space that I approach with intensity and with passion, but it's also very playful. And that's why I love Toni Morrison's writing, because she's very playful and very beautiful. And it's not structured writing because it can go anywhere. I love that flexibility. And so, with that playfulness, and I actually talk about the playfulness of writing in my book, Writing Speculative Fiction, where across all chapters, it's an emphasis of writing as fun and writing as play. And when you think of the theorist Roland Barthes, writing was really about it's a playful place, a playful space. And that's how I approach my writing. And I've always been, as part of my curiosity, if I love a writer, I'm curious to see what can we do together. It's almost like an infatuation, and it's almost like looking for that romance, but it's a romance with another writer. And I've been really fortunate with the people that I've collaborated with. So Dominic Heck, who I wrote Writing Speculative, what is it, the Speculate, which is the collection of prose poetry. Dominic was my supervisor. And you know what I said about how your PhD journey is
Yeah.
as good as your supervisor. And Dominic was just amazing. I could send her a chapter at 11 p.m. and by 6 a.m. she'd have the chapter fully with tracked changes, with lots of recommendations. She would have read it all, and there was always that respect. So she respected me as a candidate, then she respected me as a writer, and later we developed a friendship where there was that mutual respect. And so when you collaborate with somebody else, that respect has to be there,
Mhm.
because you don't approach them as a superior, and you don't you're not critical of what their offering is. It's a conversation and a partnership. And so the people that I've worked with, like Milton Davis, it was always a partnership. I really valued what he could bring in as a publisher and also as an author, particularly because he writes a lot of Black speculative fiction. And he's been in the industry a long, long
Mhm.
time. And I really wanted his experience from the US perspective. And then I've recently placed a story with Fantasy Magazine. It's called The Failing Name, where I collaborate with Seb Dobinski, he's from Denmark. So it's an Afro-Francophone story. And what Seb brings into it is that perspective of the Francophone perspective, and it's interspersed with French. And we've written it in such a way that it's an accessible story. And so even though there are phrases in French, you still get the context and you understand what the story is about. And it's a migrant story where a girl goes to live in France, and it's all about her experience. And so what Seb said to me is, he said, I will not try to put myself into the shoes of the migrant girl. So you write that first bit, and then I'll write the second bit where he writes from a different perspective. And somehow it was just a beautiful story that came
Mhm.
together.
And which,
Yeah.
sorry, and what volume is it? Issue? What issue of
It hasn't been allocated an
Oh, I see.
issue yet.
Okay.
Yet they did say it's coming out soon, and it's coming out
Okay.
in 2021. So I'm really hoping it will be soon, because it's also featuring in my upcoming collection, Downed Black Thing, which
Mhm.
is coming out through Transit Lounge Publishing in Australia. And The Failing Name is one of the stories there. I'm really fond of this story. I love it. It took a few rejections, and that's the thing about being a writer, because you really have to believe in your work. And so when I get a rejection, I don't feel that it's because the work is bad, and because normally I look at it and scrutinize it, but all I think is that it wasn't the right home for it, and it
Right.
will find the right place. And normally when it finds the right place, the enthusiasm that the editors give it, I know that this is the right place for it.
Mm. I wanted to, I, you're just so great. I'm so excited.
I am too.
You're so interesting in your passion and just like your approach is really, it's really lovely. And as a reader, you know, it's wonderful to feel that coming off the page, right? So I'm going through the Road to Whoop Whoop right now, and
Yeah, yeah.
um you know, I struggle sometimes with short story collections because I don't always know. Like I want to find some linearity to them. I want each of the stories to speak to each other in a way that I'll notice and I'll recognize, right? So I sometimes struggle with collections. Um, and what I've been trying to do as I go through, I'm trying to allow myself to just be taken along the road and
Yeah.
to just be like, you know what, enjoy each story for what it is. You don't have to look for any kind of connection, and if one emerges, that's great, but also it really is the experience. And I already have like a few favorites. These like I some like some wow, like I'm really loving it, and I love your writing. I find it challenging in a really good way. Like I feel like you trust the reader to come to the page with intelligence. And so there are spaces where my imagination can kind of explore, right? And like as an example, one of the story where I felt like I did that, the road to like the story itself, the road to Whoop Whoop was just it it reminded me of you know, when people disappear in relationships, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And but they're still there, but they're also disappearing, and or in a way they are like they're disappearing to you in a particular way, but they're fine, right? They sort of, they're okay. um and I was, as I was moving through the stories, I was thinking about, you know, taking a speculative approach, right? Like taking a creative approach to things that, to mundane things or mundane seeming things is really
Mm.
compelling. It's compelling for me. So I guess that's my long-winded way of asking you, what was your goal here and am I getting it? And you know, like what was the road to Whoop Whoop for you? What did you want to accomplish in this beautiful collection?
Yes, initially when I started writing it, what I really wanted was a collection that had some sort of theme relating to dying, the death of something. And it didn't have to be a physical death. So it could be the death of a relationship or the death of a spirit or the death of, you know, some sort of dirge. And in writing the stories and also collating some that had previously been published, I found stories that really fit this particular collection. And I also wanted a collection that brought out my hybridity. And
Mhm.
so there are African stories and there are Australian stories and there are marriage stories that bring the two together. And I think usually when I write, my focus is on the characters. I
Mhm.
really connect with people one on one, and I'm a very immersive sort of writer and a very immersive sort of reader. I feel with them, I breathe with them, I die with them. And so that immersion gets into my stories. And so that's what I really wanted for The Road to Whoop Whoop. And it varies. And at the end of the day, the publisher helped a bit because there are actually more stories than the ones that have come out in the collection.
Mm.
And I worked with the publisher because then she's clever. She rated the stories, so she had a spreadsheet where she put a rating of this is really excellent, this is okay, this is nah. It's not going there. And
Oh.
some of the nahs that go, no, really? I want that one in. And she'd say, no,
Mhm.
it's not doing it for me. And it made me understand that, you know, reading is also a very subjective experience because some of the stories that I thought were okay and she was crazy about, and some of the stories that I was crazy about, she was just okay. But then we had some stories where we both thought these are really good stories. And it's how I learned how story collections are put together, because she said we need to start with strong stories at the beginning and then intersperse it with okay stories and then have some strong stories in the middle, because then it keeps the reader going, and
Yeah.
then finish off with something really strong. And she was crazy about Playback, the last story, which is the longest one, and she was crazy about The Road to Whoop Whoop. And so you can see just with the arrangement, like she really layered the stories. And sometimes when I read story collections, I wish that they'd done that, like really scattered the stories, because you could start with the first story and it just puts you off, or you could read the first 5 stories are amazing,
Mhm.
and then suddenly this collection just falls flat, and that's what you remember. You remember the last story that you read and you're thinking it wasn't that great, but it doesn't reflect the collection. Yeah.
Yeah. I suffer from short story collection fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
So usually 2/3, I get really restless, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I have to put down a short story collection and read a full length novel and then come back to
Mm-hmm.
it, which isn't ideal because I feel like there's a rhythm, right? There is deliberateness, um, and there's often a message in how and a tempo, right? So when you stop, kind of losing a bit of momentum, then you come back, you're a different person, you're dealing with different things, right? You might not remember the first couple of stories,
Yeah.
but I'm enjoying, definitely enjoying it. Um,
But collections are different in the sense that there is no real approach to reading them, and you can actually give yourself permission to choose stories and to read them in whichever order that you want, and just read the stories, as you go. And the beauty of the collection is that, unlike a novel where you have to sit for that long duration reading this continuous story, and if you stop it for about a week or a couple of weeks because life got in the way, you have to remind yourself what happened.
mhm,
Whereas with a story collection, you read a story and that's it. You finish that story, and you could come back a week later and pick another story, and that's it. You finish that story, and that way, so you can work with a collection across your life. And like if you're commuting, you could use each commute to read a story, one
yeah.
to work and one on the way back and one before you sleep, and it allows you that flexibility.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Go ahead.
So I've just finished, well, with Down Black Thing, what I really wanted with that particular collection was to have Black people stories, and most of them are Black protagonists. And it's a collection that really looks at otherness and hybridity. And so there's stories of migration, and there's stories about women and children, and there's stories where it's a patriarchal society, but where women and children look for a space to belong. And I really love this collection, and
Mm.
I was surprised by the publisher's reception as well. It's you really want a publisher to be excited about your stories and
Yeah.
your work. And this publisher, when he said yes, because I've been trying to get into this Transit Launch Publishing. When I was doing my PhD, I was already submitting, stories and trying to get a novel published claiming Timor. So he very nearly got claiming Timor, and he read it and he said, "There's something here. I'll think about it." But Meerkat Press came very quickly and got it. And then when I wrote Ivory's story that Newcon Press published, I sent it to Transatlant Publishing, and I really wanted them to publish it because it's a very Australian story.
Mm.
And again, he said, I think I like it, but he was thinking about it too long. And the new compress came. And so when I sent him Dung Black Thing, I was surprised how quickly he came back because I think he realized that my stories get interest elsewhere. And
Mhm.
he's really sold on this one. And then I have another collection that has recently been acquired, and this one is a collection of microfictions. It's called Saving Shadows, and it's about Black Lives Matter, and it's about climate change, and it's about the pandemic. I wrote it across last year during the pandemic, and Melbourne went through a really intense lockdown, which was
Yeah.
very lonely for me. People forget how lonely a migrant's life can be, and sometimes just thinking about it, I get teary because I've never felt so lonely in my life.
Mm.
And so I found solace in my characters and in my writing. Then we had the US elections, and I found solace in whinging about it in my flash fiction and my poetry. So there's yeah, Kofifi and How About Bleach and I Can't Breathe. All this is in it
Yeah.
because I am the mother of a black boy, and so things like I Can't Breathe are really personal to me,
Mhm.
and I can put that in my writing.
So let's talk about when they come out, and you also have Major Fools as well. So would you like to tell us more about Major Fools, and then we can talk about where we can get these jewels and when we can pick them up?
Absolutely. So, Mage of Fools is an Afrofuturistic dystopian novel, and I wrote it as an indulgence, and only because my publisher, Meerkat Press, who published Claiming Timo, kept saying, "Where's the novel? Where's the novel?" And people don't realize that as a short story writer, a short story is complete in itself. I'm not less of a writer if I haven't written a novel. And she really loved Claiming Timo, and she just wanted something else. So I said, I'm going to write an Afrofuturistic dystopian novel. I am going to set it in Tanzania. And so it's a country that I've invented called Mafinga, which is actually a town in Tanzania. And this is a story that interrogates climate change. And it's a world where all the men have died because of climate change. And it has a black protagonist, and it's a mother story. And I think that's why I really connect with it, because she has two young children, and it's a story about women coming together. So I'm looking forward to this one, and Meerkat Press is really pushing it, and they're quite pleased with what they have.
When is that one going to come out?
So this one is coming out in March 2022.
Okay.
And so between now and then, I have Danged Black Thing, which is coming out in November. Then I have Saving Shadows, the collection of microfictions, and it's illustrated. That's coming
Yes.
out in December. And then I have Major Fools, which is coming out in March 2022. So it's a really busy writing life, but I just get so focused, and I love it. And I don't know how I do it, because I have a full-time job and I have a son. He's a teenager, but they're still babies. Any
Yeah.
minute now, he could open the door like a zombie looking for food. So, yeah.
I heard they eat like a lot. They hit a point and then they just like
Yeah, yeah. But I'm also quite curious about his experience, and sometimes when I'm writing my stories, I ask him questions, because he's at that curious age where they're experimenting with things. And I ask him about his clubbing, I ask him about his friends, I ask him about the things that teenagers do. And I also wonder how he sees himself, because he is mixed race. His
Mhm.
father is white, and I think growing up, he thought he was white because he was surrounded by white people. His
Mhm.
father is white, all his cousins are white. And I think it was a rude shock when he went to school and suddenly they started calling him a brownie, and
Mhm.
he realized that he was different. But I remember this occasion when he was about 2 years old, and I was in the supermarket with a trolley. He was sitting in the trolley, and I was pushing it. And then suddenly he pointed and he said with his big voice, "Look, Mama, a brown daddy."
Mhm.
And because all his life he'd never seen a brown daddy, because his father was white. So
Mhm.
to him, mummies are brown and daddies are white. And here was a brown daddy with a little brown baby in his trolley. And it was a moment of awakening for him. Yeah.
Wow.
And I remember running away and trying to distract him. "Do you want a banana? Do you want a muffin?" And I ran away from the brown daddy because my son was being racist.
Wow.
uh,
It's amazing how those moments, right, can be so memorable and so symbolic, right? For
yes.
him,
Yeah.
all he may or may not remember that, and but certainly for you, right?
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about so you showed the writing speculative fiction. creative and critical approaches. And when I actually found this, so FireCon again, because all hail FireCon. So it was through FireCon that I found out about writing speculative fiction, and I picked up this book because I really wanted to. I aspire to, you know, to be a writer, maybe to write something, right? I've written at different times in my life, but haven't done so recently. And the reason I was so excited about this was because I wanted a book on craft written by a Black woman, ideally, right? I wanted to understand the world of the speculative through someone who had a lived experience that's very similar to mine, because I believe that our lived experiences do shape what is speculative, right, and what isn't for us. And you know, I say this often, and I each time I say it, it feels so profound to me, and that is that, like, I would have been someone's speculative fiction, someone's science fiction, someone's fantasy a year and a half ago, right? If sorry, 150 years ago, a century and a half ago, if somebody described my life, right, and said, you know, there's a woman, she's you know, married to another woman, she's a lawyer, and she lives in downtown Toronto, and she's got a YouTube channel, and you know, if somebody described me centuries ago, that I feel like the person would say that that doesn't sound real, right? It doesn't sound like this kind of life, right? Could exist, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely believe that the things that we call speculative now, you know, sometimes in time become mundane, right? And so just exploring our imagination is part of creating really a future, and marshaling our imaginations on purpose. So,
Yeah.
but writing a book about the genre within which you write, that's bold. It takes, for me, it takes confidence, and it takes agency and a sense of authority, right, to be able to say this is what it is and this is how you do it. So I would like to know how you got there, and why you thought your voice was necessary in the world of craft and books about
Yeah.
craft.
It started as a PhD project. So my PhD was one to look at a model of stories within stories for a writer of short fiction to craft a novel, but it was also looking as to whether literary writing adds to the quality of speculative fiction, and which meant looking at different genres and subgenres of speculative fiction. And so I fell in love with a lot of writers then. But in so doing, it just really opened my mind to a lot of writers. And even now, I'd love to write a 2.0 to that book, because then between then and now, I've discovered more writers, more Australian speculative fiction writers, more Black speculative fiction writers. I've just finished reading Suyi Davis Okungbowa's Son of the Storm, and it blew me completely, because it's an inverse sort of colonialism where Black is power, and women have a place of authority in society. And it's just, the story is beautifully layered, and he's invented this world that hasn't been painted with a white brush. It's a very African story, and it's also very speculative, and he has magical realism. And so I'd love to, you know, include people like Suyi in conversations about Black speculative fiction. So if I did write a second version of the book, I would have a chapter on Afrofuturism and African futurism and other futurisms. I'd talk about Black speculative fiction and different aspects of it, because you have your cyberpunk, you have your, you know, Rococo, and they're all different aspects of Black speculative fiction that Milton Davis and a lot of his colleagues have been doing really well in the US on. And so I'd love to capture that. So it feels like a work in progress now. It felt complete at the time, but there's so much more that I'd love to add to this particular book.
I would really love to read your 2.0 as well. So please let
Yeah,
me know when
yeah.
it comes out. You definitely have an audience. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
so Macmillan Higher Education has now been acquired by Bloomsbury,
Mhm.
and so I've been thinking to pitch to them. Just
Yes,
do you want a second edition of this book? Because I feel there's a lot more that we could add on to it. I'd love to do that.
yes, please. Yes. And I like your perspective. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is to not be as focused on North America,
Mm,
as as sort of the base of the books that I read. So I've been trying to read more
mm,
African authors, more Caribbean authors, and also Black authors from across the world, right? Which is why I was so
mm,
excited when I found out about your work. But I'd love to read African Asian authors, right? And
mm, mm,
African
mm.
European authors as well. So I'm all over the 2.0. I'm also sideways asking you to talk about this offline, like who should we be reading, like which writers are you really excited about? But this is about you, and I'm excited about you. So I want to talk to you more about you and what you're writing. I would like to talk about Black Moon.
Mhm,
I also want to. One of the things I really enjoy about your writing is your use of like different ways of depicting, um, you know, cr- hmm, the different ways of illustrating concepts, right? So, in
mm.
speculate, I noticed that there's changes in text. I don't know if speculate. I think that there were there illustrations? No, what it was sort of like there were not quite illustrations, but symbols and textures on the page, right? And in The Road to Whoop Whoop, there are
Yes.
illustrations, which made me super excited. So, what is it about pictures and playing with text in that way, like you do here, that that excites you?
I am a very visual person, and Black Moon in particular, I happened to stumble across this Italian illustrator, Elena Betti, who's also the same one who's done the illustrations for Saving Shadows. And if
Mm,
you see some of the images, they're just mind blowing. And I just, the marriage of the text and the visual,
yeah.
you need to work with somebody who really gets it. And so with someone like Elena Betti, I never give her any guidance. I just send her the text and say, just read it, whatever you feel, what you see, just put it on the page. And that's what she does. So she really feels the text and then she puts something, and that has perfectly come out in Black Moon. And it's beautiful in Saving Shadows, where the difference is that the the images are black and white on a grayscale. With Speculate, that's all the publisher's work. Meerkat Press is very good. She did the cover of Major Fools.
Mhm.
She also did the cover of Speculate, and she loves playing out with different designs. And so when she saw Speculate, she wanted a way to make it visual a little bit, and that I really love what she did. I didn't have any input, but I was very happy with what she did.
I think
Yeah.
it's gorgeous. It's
Yes,
so
it's
beautiful.
lovely. When I saw it, I fell in love with the cover. It was beautiful, and also Major Falls. All like she just asks, "What do you think?" And for Major Falls, I say to her, just something African, maybe a mask or something or whatever. And she came back with these different images, and at the end of the day it was just deciding on a color, because I loved everything she did.
Mhm.
And so you're really fortunate when you have a publisher who's also an artist,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
that worked well. Yeah.
And this is going to be sort of my last couple of questions. So, in terms of connecting with readers, it's you were on a panel this weekend. Where this interview is going to be aired later on this year, but in this particular moment, the nebulas are going on right now, and so it's an exciting weekend for those of us who are in the community. And you were speaking on a panel as well, as I found out today, which is awesome. My I'm wondering about the relationship between you as a writer, and readers, right? You've talked a little bit about your relationship with other writers. Either you might collaborate with them in, you know, in books like Speculate, and or you might read their work and then, you know, maybe talk about their work in works that you plan to write, like the 2.0 of writing speculative fiction. But what about readers? How do you interact with readers? What do you like? Do you like to keep a separation? Do you like to get feedback? Do you, you know, what works for you?
I am a bit of a hybrid in the sense that I can be very introverted. I'm very comfortable in my space. And I only got into social media because the publishers wanted me to be visible. And sometimes when I post something, I sort of hide for 2 days because I just can't face it. It just feels like too overwhelming. And especially, and they're all positive comments. And when you look at it and suddenly they're like 100 comments and well done and all this stuff. And it, to me, it's very overwhelming. It just like it's not me. I'm a very private person, but at the same time, I love events, and it's because I love talking about things that I'm passionate about. Get me on a topic where I'm really clued in, and I'm like a dog with a bone, and I just go with it. And you actually have to, yeah, that's enough. Your intensity is enough, you know. So that's the blend of me. So with readers, I tend to read most reviews. I've been really fortunate that the readers of my work get it. I've mostly got really positive reviews across the spectrum of my books, and usually from very credible sources, which means that readers are curious, they're open, and because I'm writing something different and it's not
Mhm.
in the traditional sense, it allows somebody to approach it with curiosity, and they're open to be astonished. And I'm okay with it if they don't like a particular story, and if they like another story, because different stories talk to different people differently. Yeah, and sometimes reading a review, it's almost, I read them in awe, because suddenly I'm seeing my story from somebody else's eye, and I'm surprised by what I see, and surprised in a good way, because it's at the back of my mind. I'm thinking, yeah, yeah.
Well, I would love to speak to you again. After I've gotten into more of your work. I can't wait to see the covers, first of all, because that's the first thing we see is we see the covers and we get very excited. But I can't wait to see the next three books that you've talked about come into the world. And it's amazing how quickly you're producing work. And I thought you were a full-time writer, so the fact that you are working full-time and then writing so much, that's mind-boggling to me. So that's amazing.
I juggle so much because I work full time. I'm a mother. I'm also an editor for a few magazines. I'm also a reader for a few magazines, and I just enjoy it. And I think if I had all the time in the world and I could write full time, I don't think I'd be able to do it, because I've learned to work in really tight timelines, and I'm very prolific that way. I don't know whether I could handle time.
That surprises me, but I don't think I'll ever be surprised by being surprised by things you say, because I
Yeah.
think if a reader asked me, you know, like I'm thinking of one particular booktuber whose work I would like to who I'd like to introduce your work to, um, and I think that for me, I haven't approached any of your work without being curious. It's always been like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Let me just read it because like this is something new, you know?
Yeah.
And thank you for daring to do that, because it helps me as a reader expand my understanding of what's possible. And it also is like that's the whole point. That's the energy of speculation, is sort of asking, well, what if, right? What if we tried
Exactly.
this? What if we did it this way? What if we had like even your the intro to speculate, like the way I will say, when I read the in lieu of a preface, I actually, like, I don't know if you can see, so I write in my books, And
Yes, okay.
and my friend does not like that about me, but she's it's my book. And so where it says in here, and so like two lovers in a provocation game, teasing and pulling while thrumming antiphons in a pulse of jouissance. I was like, I literally wrote here, I don't know if you can see it because I wrote it in gray, but I
Yeah.
literally wrote, yo, that's hot. You know? And I'm just like, I don't know that I've ever found like a preface or something in lieu of a preface to be hot in terms of, not necessarily like in a romantic way, but in this kind of like we're literally there is a bit of there is some eros to like being able to dive into the unknown and the new with someone and to create something beautiful and to talk about how enjoyable that experience was. And as a reader, it's enjoyable for me to be a part of that, right? To have the two of you say this was a pleasurable experience, it was fun, don't think too hard, just like jump in the raft and don't even worry about paddling, we got you, right? I love that, so I can't wait to see more.
Yeah. I'm really pleased to hear that. And the way, if I was giving recommendations to readers, I'd say try to read more collections and anthologies, because when you read single author collections, you get a diversity, you get a good range of their writing, because different stories, work differently. And so you get a flair of their voice. And when you read an anthology, you discover new authors, which is how I discovered lots of new authors through anthologies. You read a story and you go, wow, I'm looking for this one. And that's how I discovered Andrew Hook, who eventually I collaborated with in a story. But he writes sort of slipstream, which is like the literary strange. And when I read his first collection, I got nearly all his books. And that's how you discover new writers.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. Thank you for letting us go a little bit over time. So I really appreciate that because I love speaking to you, and I'm very excited about your work. I'm grateful for it, and I look forward to other opportunities we'll have to talk about this, just how you're doing what you do. So thank you very, very much, Eugen.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity.
Hey everyone, I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Eugen Bacon. Isn't she amazing? And her voice is so soft. She's so lovely. I had such a wonderful time speaking with her, and I got some really great recommendations. I definitely want to read through more of her books because she's a new to me author. I've only read about 3 collections of hers, and so I can't wait to get into more. And I'm also going to be working through the Writing Speculative Fiction book because I want to do a little bit of that. I tell myself, I promise you. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just some reflections from things that she said and things that we discussed in our interview. First is hybridity and how being Australian and African, how being a woman, how being a mother, how all of those different identities, and sometimes those identities that can be kind of opposite to each other, how they come together to kind of produce a standpoint from which she writes. I have to say, when I read Black Moon, there were a number of stories about children, and I thought to myself, wow, I'm not sure me in my life stage right now would have been able to produce that kind of story. There's an intimacy that I think must come from parenting, or at least caring for a child, that really leapt off of the page. And it was really, really interesting that those stories about children came from a collection of horror stories, because there are a lot of things we fear when it comes to children and the safety of children. In any event, I hope that you enjoyed that discussion. There are a couple of other things that I want to reflect on. The other piece is writing with other authors. I don't know of another writer that writes with other authors as much as Eugen Bacon does. So that was really interesting for me. And I'm really actually more curious about how you do that. Like, how do you actually go about writing with other authors? So that is something that I'm going to spend a little bit more time thinking about. And then finally, the importance of short fiction and the effectiveness of short fiction to sort of get to the point, and then to move on. I like how she talked about giving yourself permission to read short fiction and collections slowly, to move through them, to be okay, to mix up the order. I think that advice goes not only for reading short fiction, but also writing short fiction. What do you think? And of course, I'm gonna choose a card from the Harvest of Survival deck. Let us see. These plants are eating me. I think I got a mosquito bite. Which I think is like right over here. We'll see. Anyway, so I am picking a card. And let's see how this connects to the discussion with Eugen Bacon. This is a quote from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is an incredible writer, healer, community activist. You definitely need to read her work. She has Radical Motherhood, and she recently came out with a book like just that is poetry and meditations from marine mammals. Just amazing. She's incredible. Anyway, her quote is, "I am proud of you for letting the tide of your revolutionary heritage grind your fear of failure and lack into sand." I am proud of you for letting the tide of your revolutionary heritage grind your fear of failure and lack into sand. I love you, the me that I was. That's really beautiful. That speaks to me about, being okay with the person you were. And Eugen Bacon talks about that a little bit when she talked about like first writing white characters and not feeling like she could actually write black characters. And then over time and migration, she felt more comfortable and now centers her work on black people. And I thought that was really, really powerful. And that's the idea of sort of, allowing a past you to grind the present you into perfection, I think. And the question here is, and this is going to be an interesting one for you in the comments, write a love note to your younger self. Now, this might be a little odd for you to do in the comments of a YouTube video, but maybe just one affirmative sentence to your younger self. That would be really cool. And why am I asking you to do this? If you're new to the series, there's going to be a giveaway of the Melanin Eclectic Reading Planner for 2022. One winner will be selected for each author interview. So if you want to be entered into the draw for Eugen Bacon's reading planner selection, then I would ask you to do 4 things. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and then answer the question or respond to the prompt. Write a love sentence to your younger self. I hope that you enjoyed my discussion with Eugen Bacon, and this was discussion number 2 in this series. And remember to always read with purpose. I will see you in the next video. Bye.